Chapter 46 of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 46. Several days had passed since her futile journey, and Tess was afield. The dry winter wind still blew, but a screen of thatched hurdles erected in the eye of the blast kept its force away from her. On the sheltered side was a turnip-slicing machine, whose bright blue hue of new paint seemed almost vocal in the otherwise subdued scene. Opposite its front was a long mound or grave, in which the roots had been preserved since early winter. Tess was standing at the uncovered end, chopping off with a billhook the fibres and earth from each root, and throwing it after the operation into the slicer. A man was turning the handle of the machine, and from its trough came the newly cut swedes, the fresh smell of whose yellow chips was accompanied by the sounds of the snuffling wind, the smart swish of the slicing blades, and the choppings of the hook in Tess's leather-gloved hand. The wide acreage of blank agricultural brownness, apparent where the swedes had been pulled, was beginning to be striped in wales of darker brown, gradually broadening to ribbons. Along the edge of each of these something crept upon 10 legs, moving without haste and without rest up and down the whole length of the field. It was 2 horses and a man, the plough going between them, turning up the cleared ground for a spring sowing. For hours nothing relieved the joyless monotony of things. Then, far beyond the ploughing teams, a black speck was seen. It had come from the corner of a fence where there was a gap, and its tendency was up the incline towards the swede cutters. From the proportions of a mere point it advanced to the shape of a 9-pin, and was soon perceived to be a man in black, arriving from the direction of Flintcomb Ash. The man at the slicer, having nothing else to do with his eyes, continually observed the comer, but Tess, who was occupied, did not perceive him till her companion directed her attention to his approach. It was not her hard taskmaster, Farmer Groby. It was one in a semi-clerical costume, who now represented what had once been the free and easy Alec d'Urberville. Not being hot at his preaching, there was less enthusiasm about him now, and the presence of the grinder seemed to embarrass him. A pale distress was already on Tess's face, and she pulled her curtained hood further over it. D'Urberville came up and said quietly, "I want to speak to you, Tess." "You have refused my last request not to come near me," said she. "Yes, but I have a good reason." "Well, tell it." "It is more serious than you may think." He glanced round to see if he were overheard. They were at some distance from the man who turned the slicer, and the movement of the machine too sufficiently prevented Alec's words reaching other ears. D'Urberville placed himself so as to screen Tess from the labourer, turning his back to the latter. "It is this," he continued with capricious compunction. "In thinking of your soul and mine when we last met, I neglected to inquire as to your worldly condition. You were well dressed, and I did not think of it. But I see now that it is hard, harder than it used to be when I knew you, harder than you deserve. Perhaps a good deal of it is owing to me." She did not answer, and he watched her inquiringly as, with bent head, her face completely screened by the hood, she resumed her trimming of the swedes. By going on with her work she felt better able to keep him outside her emotions. "Tess," he added with a sigh of discontent, "yours was the very worst case I was ever concerned in. I had no idea of what had resulted till you told me. Scamp that I was to foul that innocent life! The whole blame was mine, the whole unconventional business of our time at Trantridge.
You, too, the real blood of which I am but a base imitation. What a blind young thing you were as to possibilities! I say in all earnestness that it is a shame for parents to bring up their girls in such dangerous ignorance of the gins and nets that the wicked may set for them, whether their motive be a good one or the result of simple indifference." Tess still did no more than listen, throwing down one globular root and taking up another with automatic regularity, the pensive contour of the mere field woman alone marking her. "But it is not that I came to say," d'Urberville went on. "My circumstances are these. I have lost my mother since you were at Trantridge, and the place is my own, but I intend to sell it and devote myself to missionary work in Africa. A devil of a poor hand I shall make at the trade, no doubt. However, what I want to ask you is, will you put it in my power to do my duty, to make the only reparation I can make for the trick I played you? That is, will you be my wife and go with me? I have already obtained this precious document. It was my old mother's dying wish." He drew a piece of parchment from his pocket with a slight fumbling of embarrassment. "What is it?" said she. "A marriage licence." "Oh no, sir, no!" she said quickly, starting back. "You will not? Why is that?" As he asked the question, a disappointment which was not entirely the disappointment of thwarted duty crossed d'Urberville's face. It was unmistakably a symptom that something of his old passion for her had been revived. Duty and desire ran hand in hand. "Surely," he began again in more impetuous tones, and then looked round at the labourer who turned the slicer. Tess, too, felt that the argument could not be ended there. Informing the man that a gentleman had come to see her, with whom she wished to walk a little way, she moved off with d'Urberville across the zebra-striped field. When they reached the first newly ploughed section, he held out his hand to help her over it, and she stepped forward on the summits of the earth rolls as if she did not see him. "You will not marry me, Tess, and make me a self-respecting man?" he repeated as soon as they were over the furrows. "I cannot." "But why?" "You know I have no affection for you." "But you would get to feel that in time, perhaps, as soon as you really could forgive me?" "Never." "Why so positive?" "I love somebody else." The words seemed to astonish him. "You do?" he cried. "Somebody else? But has not a sense of what is morally right and proper any weight with you?" "No, no, no, don't say that." "Anyhow, then, your love for this other man may only be a passing feeling which you will overcome." "No, no." "Yes, yes, why not?" "I cannot tell you." "You must, in honour." "Well, then, I have married him." "Ah!" he exclaimed, and he stopped dead and gazed at her. "I did not wish to tell. I did not mean to," she pleaded. "It is a secret here, or at any rate but dimly known. So will you, please, will you, keep from questioning me? You must remember that we are now strangers." "Strangers, are we? Strangers?" For a moment a flash of his old irony marked his face, but he determinedly chastened it down. "Is that man your husband?" he asked mechanically, denoting by a sign the labourer who turned the machine. "That man?" she said proudly. "I should think not." "Who then?" "Do not ask what I do not wish to tell," she begged, and flashed her appeal to him from her upturned face and lash-shadowed eyes. D'Urberville was disturbed. "But I only asked for your sake," he retorted hotly. "Angels of heaven, God forgive me for such an expression! I came here, I swear, as I thought for your good. Tess, don't look at me so. I cannot stand your looks. There never were such eyes, surely, before Christianity or since. There, I won't lose my head. I dare not. I own that the sight of you had wakened up my love for you, which I believed was extinguished with all such feelings. But I thought that our marriage might be a sanctification for us both. The unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband, I said to myself. But my plan is dashed from me, and I must bear the disappointment." He moodily reflected with his eyes on the ground. "Married, married! Well, that being so," he added quite calmly, tearing the licence slowly into halves and putting them in his pocket, "that being prevented, I should like to do some good for you and your husband, whoever he may be. There are many questions that I am tempted to ask, but I will not do so, of course, in opposition to your wishes. Though, if I could know your husband, I might more easily benefit him and you. Is he on this farm?" "No," she murmured. "He is far away." "Far away? From you? What sort of a husband can he be?" "Oh, do not speak against him. It was through you he found out." "Ah, it is so. That's sad, Tess." "Yes." "But to stay away from you, to leave you to work like this!" "He does not leave me to work," she cried, springing to the defence of the absent one with all her fervour. "He don't know it. It is by my own arrangement." "Then does he write?" I cannot tell you. There are things which are private to ourselves." "Of course that means that he does not. You are a deserted wife, my fair Tess." In an impulse he turned suddenly to take her hand. The buff glove was on it, and he seized only the rough leather fingers which did not express the life or shape of those within. "You must not, you must not!" she cried fearfully, slipping her hand from the glove as from a pocket and leaving it in his grasp. "Oh, will you go away, for the sake of me and my husband? Go, in the name of your own Christianity!" Yes, I will," he said abruptly, and thrusting the glove back to her he turned to leave. Facing round, however, he said, "Tess, as God is my judge, I meant no humbug in taking your hand." A pattering of hoofs on the soil of the field, which they had not noticed in their preoccupation, ceased close behind them, and a voice reached her ear.
"What the devil are you doing away from your work at this time of day?"
Farmer Groby had espied the two figures from the distance, and had inquisitively ridden across to learn what was their business in his field.
"Don't speak like that to her,"
said d'Urberville, his face blackening with something that was not Christianity.
"Indeed, mister, and what mid-Methodist parsons have to do with she?"
"Who is the fellow?" asked d'Urberville, turning to Tess. She went close up to him. "Go, I do beg you," she said.
"What, and leave you to that tyrant? I can see in his face what a churl he is."
"He won't hurt me. He's not in love with me. I can leave at Lady Day."
"Well, I have no right to obey, I suppose, but, well, goodbye."
Her defender, whom she dreaded more than her assailant, having reluctantly disappeared, the farmer continued his reprimand, which Tess took with the greatest coolness, that sort of attack being independent of sex. To have as a master this man of stone, who would have cuffed her if he had dared, was almost a relief after her former experiences. She silently walked back towards the summit of the field that was the scene of her labour, so absorbed in the interview which had just taken place that she was hardly aware that the nose of Groby's horse almost touched her shoulders.
"If so be you make an arrangement to work for me till Lady Day, I'll see you carry it out," he growled. "Od rot the women! Now 'tis one thing, and then 'tis the other. But I'll put up with it no longer."
Knowing very well that he did not harass the other women of the farm as he harassed her out of spite for the flooring he had once received, she did for one moment picture what might have been the result if she had been free to accept the offer just made of her, of being the moneyed Alec's wife. it would have lifted her completely out of subjection, not only to her present oppressive employer, but to a whole world who seemed to despise her. "But no, no," she said breathlessly. "I could not have married him now. He is so unpleasant to me." That very night she began an appealing letter to Clare, concealing from him her hardships and assuring him of her undying affection. Anyone who had been in a position to read between the lines would have seen that at the back of her great love was some monstrous fear, almost a desperation, as to some secret contingencies which were not disclosed. But again she did not finish her effusion. He had asked Izz to go with him, and perhaps he did not care for her at all. She put the letter in her box, and wondered if it would ever reach Angel's hands. After this her daily tasks were gone through heavily enough, and brought on the day which was of great import to agriculturalists, the day of the Candlemas Fair. It was at this fair that new engagements were entered into for the 12 months following the ensuing Lady Day, and those of the farming population who thought of changing their places duly attended at the county town where the fair was held. Nearly all the labourers at Flintcomb Farm intended flight, and early in the morning there was a general exodus in the direction of the town, which lay at a distance of from 10 to a dozen miles over hilly country. Though Tess also meant to leave at the quarter day, she was one of the few who did not go to the fair, having a vaguely shaped hope that something would happen to render another outdoor engagement unnecessary. It was a peaceful February day, of wonderful softness for the time, and one would almost have thought that winter was over. She had hardly finished her dinner when d'Urberville's figure darkened the window of the cottage wherein she was a lodger, which she had all to herself to-day. Tess jumped up, but her visitor had knocked at the door, and she could hardly in reason run away. D'Urberville's knock, his walk up to the door, had some indescribable quality of difference from his air when she last saw him. They seemed to be acts of which the doer was ashamed. She thought that she would not open the door, but as there was no sense in that either, she arose, and having lifted the latch, stepped back quickly. He came in, saw her, and flung himself down to a chair before speaking. "Tess, I couldn't help it," he began desperately as he wiped his heated face, which had also a superimposed flush of excitement. "I felt that I must call at least to ask how you are. I assure you that I have not been thinking of you at all till I saw you that Sunday. Now I cannot get rid of your image, try how I may. It is hard that a good woman should do harm to a bad man, yet so it is. If you would only pray for me, Tess." The suppressed discontent of his manner was almost pitiable, and yet Tess did not pity him. "How can I pray for you," she said, "when I am forbidden to believe that the great Power who moves the world will alter his plans on my account?" "You really think that?" "Yes, I have been cured of the presumption of thinking otherwise." "Cured? By whom?" "By my husband, if I must tell." "Ah, your husband, your husband. How strange it seems. I remember you hinted something of the sort the other day." "What do you really believe in these matters, Tess?" he asked. "You seem to have no religion, perhaps owing to me." "But I have, though I don't believe in anything supernatural." D'Urberville looked at her with misgiving. "Then do you think that the line I take is all wrong?" "A good deal of it." "And yet I felt so sure about it," he said uneasily. "I believe in the spirit of the Sermon on the Mount, and so did my dear husband, but I don't believe—" Here she gave her negations. "The fact is," said d'Urberville dryly, "whatever your dear husband believed you accept, and whatever he rejected you'll reject, without the least inquiry or reasoning on your own part. It's just like you women. Your mind is enslaved to his." "Ah, because he knew everything," said she, with a triumphant simplicity of faith in Angel Clare that the most perfect man could hardly have deserved, much less her husband. "Yes, but you should not take negative opinions wholesale from another person like that. A pretty fellow he must be to teach you such scepticism." "He never forced my judgment. He would never argue on the subject with me. But I looked at it in this way. What he believed, after inquiring deep into doctrines, was much more likely to be right than what I might believe, who hadn't looked into doctrines at all." "What used he to say? He must have said something." She reflected, and with her accurate memory for the letter of Angel Clare's remarks, even when she did not comprehend their spirit, she recalled a merciless polemical syllogism that she had heard him use when, as it occasionally happened, he indulged in a species of thinking aloud with her at his side. In delivering it she also gave Clare's accent and manner with reverential faithfulness. "Say that again," asked d'Urberville, who had listened with the greatest attention. She repeated the argument, and d'Urberville thoughtfully murmured the words after her. "Anything else?" he presently asked. "He said at another time something like this," and she gave another, which might possibly have been paralleled in many a work of the pedigree, ranging from the Dictionnaire Philosophique to Huxley's Essays. "Aha! How do you remember them?" "I wanted to believe what he believed, though he didn't wish me to, and I managed to coax him to tell me a few of his thoughts. I can't say I quite understood that one, but I know it is right." "Fancy your being able to teach me what you don't know yourself." He fell into thought. "And so I threw in my spiritual lot with his," she resumed. "I didn't wish to be different. What's good enough for him is good enough for me." "Does he know that you are as big an infidel as he?" "No, I never told him, if I am an infidel." "Well, you are better off to-day than I am, Tess, after all. You don't believe that you ought to preach my doctrine, and therefore do not despise to your conscience in abstaining. I do believe I ought to preach it, but, like the devils, I believe and tremble, for I suddenly leave off preaching it, and give way to my passion for you." "How?" "Why," he said aridly, "I have come all the way here to see you to-day. But I started from home to go to the Casterbridge Fair, where I have undertaken to preach the word from a waggon at 2:30 this afternoon, and where all the brethren are expecting me this minute. Here's the announcement." He drew from his breast pocket a poster whereupon was printed the day, hour, and place of meeting, at which he, d'Urberville, would preach the gospel as aforesaid. "But how can you get there?" said Tess, looking at the clock. "I cannot get there. I have come here." "What? You've really arranged to preach, and—" "I have arranged to preach, and I shall not be there, by reason of my burning desire to see a woman whom I once despised. No, by my word and truth, I never despised you. If I had, I should not love you now. Why I did not despise you was on account of your being unsmirched in spite of all. You withdrew yourself from me so quickly and resolutely when you saw the situation. You did not remain at my pleasure. So there was one petticoat in the world for whom I had no contempt, and you are she. But you may well despise me now. I thought I worshipped on the mountains, but I find I still serve in the groves. Ha ha!" "Oh, Alec d'Urberville, what does this mean? What have I done?" "Done?" he said, with a soulless sneer in the word. "Nothing intentionally, but you have been the means, the innocent means of my backsliding, as they call it. I ask myself, am I indeed one of those servants of corruption who, after they have escaped the pollutions of the world, are again entangled therein and overcome, whose latter end is worse than their beginning?" He laid his hand on her shoulder. Tess, my girl, I was on the way to at least social salvation till I saw you again," he said, freakishly shaking her as if she were a child. "And why then have you tempted me? I was firm as a man could be till I saw those eyes and that mouth again. Surely there never was such a maddening mouth since Eve's." His voice sank, and a hot archness shot from his own black eyes. "You temptress, Tess, you dear damned witch of Babylon, I could not resist you as soon as I met you again." "I could not help your seeing me again," said Tess, recoiling. "I know it. I repeat that I do not blame you. But the fact remains. When I saw you ill-used on the farm that day, I was nearly mad to think that I had no legal right to protect you, that I could not have it, whilst he who has it seems to neglect you utterly." "Don't speak against him. He is absent," she cried in much excitement. "Treat him honourably. He has never wronged you. Oh, leave his wife before any scandal spreads that may do harm to his honest name." I will," he said, like a man awakening from a luring dream. "I have broken my engagement to preach to those poor drunken boobies at the fair. It is the first time I have played such a practical joke. A month ago I should have been horrified at such a possibility. I'll go away to swear, and, can I? To keep away." Then suddenly, "One clasp, Tessie, one, only for old friendship." "I am without defence, Alec. A good man's honour is in my keeping. Think, be ashamed." "Pooh! Well, yes. He clenched his lips, mortified with himself for his weakness. His eyes were equally barren of worldly and religious faith. The corpses of those old fitful passions which had lain inanimate amid the lines of his face ever since his reformation seemed to wake and come together as in a resurrection. He went out indeterminately. Though d'Urberville had declared that this breach of his engagement today was the simple backsliding of a believer, Tess's words, as echoed from Angel Clare, had made a deep impression upon him, and continued to do so after he had left her. He moved on in silence, as if his energies were benumbed by the hitherto undreamt of possibility that his position was untenable. Reason had had nothing to do with his whimsical conversion, which was perhaps the mere freak of a careless man in search of a new sensation, and temporarily impressed by his mother's death. The drops of logic Tess had let fall into the sea of his enthusiasm served to chill its effervescence to stagnation. He said to himself, as he pondered again and again over the crystallized phrases that she had handed on to him, "That clever fellow little thought that, by telling her those things, he might be paving my way back to her." End of chapter 46. Of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Praetzellis.
Chapter 47. It is the threshing of the last wheat rick at Flintcomb Farm. The dawn of the March morning is singularly impressive, and there is nothing to show where the eastern horizon lies. Against the twilight rises the trapezoidal top of the stack, which has stood forlornly here through the washing and bleaching of the wintry weather. When East Hewitt and Tess arrived at the scene of the operations, only a rustling denoted that others had preceded them, to which, as the light increased, there were presently added the silhouettes of two men on the summit. They were busily unhaling the rick, that is, stripping off the thatch before beginning to throw down the sheaves, and while this was in progress, Izz and Tess, with the other women workers in their whitey brown pinners, stood waiting and shivering, Farmer Groby having insisted upon their being on the spot thus early to get the job over, if possible, by the end of the day. Close under the eaves of the stack, and as yet barely visible, was the red tyrant that the woman had come to serve. A timber frame construction with straps and wheels appertaining, the threshing machine which, whilst it was going, kept up a despotic demand upon the endurance of their muscles and nerves. A little way off there was another indistinct figure, this one black, with a sustained hiss that spoke of strength very much in reserve. The long chimney running up beside an ash tree, and the warmth which radiated from the spot, explained without the necessity of much daylight that here was the engine which was to act as the primum mobile of this little world. By the engine stood a dark motionless being, a sooty and grimy embodiment of tallness, in a sort of trance, with a heap of coals by his side. It was the engine man. The isolation of his manner and colour lent him the appearance of a creature of Tophet who had strayed into the pellucid smokelessness of this region of yellow grain and pale soil, with which he had nothing in common, to amaze and discompose its aborigines. What he looked he felt. He was in the agricultural world, but not of it. He served fire and smoke. These denizens of the field served vegetation, weather, frost and sun. He travelled with his engine from farm to farm, from county to county, for as yet the steam threshing machine was itinerant in this part of Wessex. He spoke in a strange northern accent, his thoughts being turned inward upon himself, his eye on his iron charge, hardly perceiving the scenes around him, and caring for them not at all, holding only strictly necessary intercourse with the natives, as if some ancient doom compelled him to wander here against his will in the service of his plutonic master. The long strap which ran from the driving wheel of his engine to the red thresher under the rick was the sole tie-line between agriculture and him. While they uncovered the sheaves, he stood apathetic beside his portable repository of force, round whose hot blackness the morning air quivered. He had nothing to do with preparatory labour. His fire was waiting, incandescent. His steam was at high pressure. In a few seconds he would make the long strap move at an invisible velocity. Beyond its extent the environment might be corn, straw, or chaos. It was all the same to him. If any of the autochthonous idlers asked him what he called himself, he replied shortly, "An engineer." The rick was unhailed by full daylight. The men then took their places, the women mounted, and the work began. Farmer Groby, or as they called him, he, had arrived ere this, and by his orders Tess was placed on the platform of the machine, close to the man who fed it, her business being to untie every sheaf of corn handed to her by Izz Hewitt, who stood next, but on the rick, so that the feeder could seize it and spread it over the revolving drum, which whisked out every grain in one moment. They were soon in full progress after a preparatory hitch or two, which rejoiced the hearts of those who hated machinery. The work sped on till breakfast time, when the thresher was stopped for half an hour, and on starting again after the meal, the whole supplementary strength of the farm was thrown into the labour of constructing the straw rick, which began to grow beside the stack of corn. A hasty lunch was eaten as they stood, without leaving their positions, and then another couple of hours brought them near to dinner time, the inexorable wheel continuing to spin, and the penetrating hum of the thresher to thrill to the very marrow all who were near the revolving wire cage. The old men on the rising straw rick talked of the past days, when they had been accustomed to thresh with flails on the oaken barn floor, when everything, even to winnowing, was effected by hand labour, which, to their thinking, though slow, produced better results. Those too on the corn rick talked a little, but the perspiring ones at the machine, including Tess, could not lighten their duties by an exchange of many words. It was the ceaselessness of the work which tired her so severely, and began to make her wish that she had never come to Flintcomb. The women on the corn-rick, Marian, who was one of them in particular, could stop to drink ale or cold tea from the flagon now and then, or to exchange a few gossiping remarks while they wiped their faces or cleared the fragments of straw and husk from their clothing. But for Tess there was no respite, for, as the drum never stopped, the man who fed it could not stop, and she, who had to supply the man with untied sheaves, could not stop either, unless Marian changed places with her, which she sometimes did for half an hour, in spite of Groby's objections that she was too slow-handed for a feeder. For some probably economical reason, it was usually a woman who was chosen for this particular duty, and Groby gave as his motive in selecting Tess that she was one of those who best combined strength with quickness in untying, and both with staying power, and this may have been true. The hum of the thresher, which prevented speech, increased to a raving whenever the supply of corn fell short of the regular quantity. As Tess and the man who fed could never turn their heads, she did not know that just before the dinner hour a person had come silently into the field by the gate, and had been standing under a second rick watching the scene, and Tess in particular. He was dressed in a tweed suit of fashionable pattern, and he twirled a gay walking cane. "Who is that?" said Izz Huett to Marian. She had at first addressed the inquiry to Tess, but the latter could not hear it. "Somebody's fancy man, I suppose," said Marian laconically. "I'll lay a guinea he's after Tess." "Oh no, 'tis a ranter parson who's been sniffing after her lately, not a dandy like this." "Well, 'tis the same man." "The same man as the preacher? Why, he's quite different." "He have left off his black coat and white neckerchief, and have cut off his whiskers, but he's the same man for all that." "Do we really think so? Then I'll tell her," said Marian. "Don't. She'll see him soon enough, good now." "Well, I don't think it at all right for him to join his preaching to courting a married woman, even though her husband mid be abroad, and she, in a sense, a widow." "Oh, he can do her no harm," said Izz dryly. "Her mind can no more be heaved from that one place where it do abide than a studded waggon from the hole he's in. Lord love 'ee, neither court paying nor preaching, nor the seven thunders themselves can wean a woman when 'twould better for her that she should be weaned." Dinner time came, and the whirling ceased, whereupon Tess left her post, her knees trembling so wretchedly with the shaking of the machine that she could scarcely walk. "You ought to het a quart of drink into 'ee, as I've done," said Marian. "You wouldn't look so white then. Why, souls above us, your face is as if you'd been haggard." It occurred to the good-natured Marian that, as Tess was so tired, her discovery of her visitor's presence might have the bad effect of taking away her appetite, and Marian was thinking of inducing Tess to descend by a ladder on the further side of the stack, when the gentleman came forward and looked up. Tess uttered a short little "Oh!" and a moment after she said quickly, "I shall eat my dinner here, right on the rick." Sometimes when they were so far from their cottages they all did this, but as there was a rather keen wind going to-day, Marian and the rest descended and sat under the straw stack. The newcomer was indeed Alec d'Urberville, the late evangelist, despite his changed attire and aspect. It was obvious at a glance that the original Weltlust had come back, that he had restored himself, as nearly as a man could do who had grown 3 or 4 years older, to the old jaunty slapdash guise under which Tess had first known her admirer and cousin, so-called. Having decided to remain where she was, Tess sat down among the bundles, out of sight on the ground, and began her meal, till by and by she heard footsteps on the ladder, and immediately after Alec appeared upon the stack, now an oblong and level platform of sheaves. He strode across them and sat down opposite of her without a word. Tess continued to eat her modest dinner, a slice of thick pancake which she had brought with her. The other workfolk were by this time all gathered under the rick, where the loose straw formed a comfortable retreat. "I am here again, as you'll see," said d'Urberville. "Why do you trouble me so?" she cried, reproach flashing from her very finger ends. "I trouble you? I think I may ask, why do you trouble me?" "Sure, I don't trouble you anywhen." "You say you don't, but you do. You haunt me. Those very eyes that you turned upon me with such a bitter flash a moment ago, they come to me just as you showed them then, in the night and in the day. Tess, ever since you told me of that child of ours, it is just as if my feelings, which had been flowing in a strong puritanical stream, had suddenly found a way open in the direction of you, and had all at once gushed through. The religious channel is left dry forthwith, and it is you who have done it." She gazed in silence. "What? You have given up your preaching entirely?" she asked. She had gathered from Angel sufficient of the incredulity of modern thought to despise flash enthusiasm, but as a woman she was somewhat appalled. In affected severity d'Urberville continued, "Entirely. I have broken every engagement since that afternoon I was to address the drunkards at Casterbridge Fair. The deuce only knows what I am thought of by the brethren. Ha ha! The brethren! No doubt they pray for me, weep for me, for they are kind people in their way. But what do I care? How could I go on with the thing when I had lost my faith in it? It would have been hypocrisy of the basest kind. Among them I should have stood like Hymenaeus and Alexander, who were delivered over to Satan that they might learn not to blaspheme. What a grand revenge you have taken! I saw you innocent, and I deceived you. 4 years after, you find me a Christian enthusiast. You then work upon me, perhaps to my complete perdition. But Tess, my coz, as I used to call you, this is only my way of talking, and you must not look so horribly concerned. Of course you have done nothing except retain your pretty face and shapely figure. I saw it on the rick before you saw me. That tight pinafore thing sets it off, and that wing bonnet. You field girls should never wear those bonnets if you wish to keep out of danger." He regarded her silently for a few moments, and with a short cynical laugh resumed, "I believe that if the bachelor apostle, whose deputy I thought I was, had been tempted by such a pretty face, he would have let go the plough for her sake, as I do." Tess attempted to expostulate, but at this juncture all her fluency failed her, and without heeding he added, "Well, this paradise that you supply is perhaps as good as any other after all. But to speak seriously, Tess—" D'Urberville rose and came nearer, reclining sideways amid the sheaves, and resting upon his elbow. "Since I last saw you I have been thinking of what you said that he said. I have come to the conclusion that there does seem rather a want of common sense in these threadbare old propositions. How I could have been so fired by poor Parson Clare's enthusiasm, and have gone so madly to work, transcending even him, I cannot make out. As for what you said last time, on the strength of your wonderful husband's intelligence, whose name you have never told me, about having what they call an ethical system without any dogma, I don't see my way to that at all." "Why, you can have the religion of loving kindness and purity at least, if you can't have, what do you call it, dogma." "Oh no, I'm a different sort of fellow from that. If there's nobody to say, do this and it will be a good thing for you after you're dead, do that and it will be a bad thing for you, I can't warm up. Hang it, I'm not going to feel responsible for my deeds and passions if there's nobody to be responsible to. And if I were you, my dear, I wouldn't either." She tried to argue and tell him that he had mixed up in his dull brain two matters, theology and morals, which in the primitive days of mankind had been quite distinct. But owing to Angel Clare's reticence, to her absolute want of training, and to her being a vessel of emotions rather than reasons, she could not get on. "Well, never mind," he resumed. "Here I am, my love, as in the old times." "Not as then, never as then. 'Tis different," she entreated. "And there was never warmth with me. Oh, why didn't you keep to your faith, if the loss of it has brought you to speak to me like this?" "Because you've knocked it out of me, so the evil be upon your sweet head. Your husband little thought how his teaching would recoil upon him. Ha ha! I'm awfully glad you've made an apostate of me all the same. Tess, I am more taken with you than ever, and I pity you too. For all your closeness, I see you are in a bad way, neglected by one who ought to cherish you." She could not get her morsels of food down her throat. Her lips were dry, and she was ready to choke. The voices and laughs of the workfolk, eating and drinking under the rick, came to her as if they were a quarter of a mile off. "It is cruelty to me," she said. "How can you treat me to this talk, if you care ever so little for me?" "True, true," he said, wincing a little. "I did not come to reproach you for my deeds. I came, Tess, to say that I don't like you to be working like this, and I have come on purpose for you. You say you have a husband who is not I. Well, perhaps you have, but I've never seen him, and you've not told me his name, and altogether he seems a rather mythological personage. However, even if you have one, I think I'm nearer to you than he is. I, at any rate, try to help you out of trouble, but he does not, bless his invisible face. The words of the stern prophet Hosea that I used to read came back to me. Don't you know them, Tess? And she shall follow after her lover, but she shall not overtake him. And she shall seek him, and shall not find him. Then shall she say, I will go and return to my first husband, for then it was better with me than now. Tess, my trap is waiting just under the hill, and, darling mine, not his, you know the rest." Her face had been rising to a dull crimson fire while he spoke, but she did not answer. "You have been the cause of my backsliding," he continued, stretching his arm towards her waist. "You should be willing to share it, and leave that mule you call husband for ever." One of her leather gloves, which she had taken off to eat her simmer cake, lay in her lap, and without the slightest warning she passionately swung the glove by the gauntlet directly in his face. It was heavy and thick as a warrior's, and it struck him flat on the mouth. Fancy might have regarded the act as the recrudescence of a trick in which her armed progenitors were not unpractised. Alec fiercely started up from his reclining position. A scarlet oozing appeared where her blow had alighted, and in a moment the blood began dropping from his mouth upon the straw. But he soon controlled himself, calmly drew his handkerchief from his pocket, and mopped his bleeding lips. She too had sprung up, but she sank down again. "Now punish me," she said, turning up her eyes to him with the hopeless defiance of the sparrow's gaze before its captor twists its neck. "Whip me, crush me. You need not mind these people under the rick. I shall not cry out. Once victim, always victim. That's the law." "Oh no, Tess," he said blandly. "I can make full allowance for this, yet you most unjustly forget one thing, that I would have married you if you had not put it out of my power to do so. Did I not ask you flatly to be my wife, eh? Answer me." "You did." "And you cannot be. But remember one thing." His voice hardened as his temper got the better of him, with the recollection of his sincerity in asking her and her present ingratitude, and he stepped across to her side and held her by the shoulders so that she shook under his grasp. "Remember, my lady, I was your master once. I will be your master again. If you are any man's wife, you are mine." The threshers now began to stir below. "So much for our quarrel," he said, letting her go. "Now I shall leave you, and I shall come again for your answer during the afternoon. You don't know me yet, but I know you." She had not spoken again, remaining as if stunned. D'Urberville retreated over the sheaves and descended the ladder, while the workers below rose and stretched their arms, and shook down the beer they had drunk. Then the threshing machine started afresh, and amid the renewed rustle of the straw Tess resumed her position by the buzzing drum as one in a dream, untying sheaf after sheaf in endless succession. End of chapter 47. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Praetzellis.
Chapter 48. In the afternoon the farmer made it known that the rick was to be finished that night, since there was a moon by which they could see to work, and the man with the engine was engaged for another farm on the morrow. Hence the twanging and humming and rustling proceeded with even less intermission than usual. It was not till Nammet time, about 3 o'clock, that Tess raised her eyes and gave a momentary glance round. She felt but little surprise at seeing that Alec d'Urberville had come back and was standing under the hedge by the gate. He had seen her lift her eyes and waved his hand urbanely to her, while he blew her a kiss. It meant that their quarrel was over. Tess looked down again, and carefully abstained from gazing in that direction. Thus the afternoon dragged on. The wheat rick shrank lower, and the straw rick grew higher, and the corn sacks were carted away. At 6 o'clock the wheat rick was about shoulder high from the ground, but the unthreshed sheaves remaining untouched seemed countless still, notwithstanding the enormous numbers that had been gulped down by the insatiable swallower, fed by the man and Tess, through whose young hands the greater part of them had passed. And the immense stack of straw, where in the morning there had been nothing, appeared as the faeces of the same buzzing red glutton. From the west sky a wrathful shine, all that wild March could afford in the way of sunset, had burst forth after the cloudy day, flooding the tired and sticky faces of the threshers, and dyeing them with a coppery light, as also the flapping garments of the women, which clung to them like dull flames. A panting ache ran through the rick. The man who fed was weary, and Tess could see that the red nape of his neck was encrusted with dirt and husks. She still stood at her post, her flushed and perspiring face coated with the corn dust, and her white bonnet embrowned by it. She was the only woman whose place was upon the machine so as to be shaken bodily by its spinning, and the decrease of the stack now separated her from Marian and Izz, and prevented their changing duties with her as they had done. The incessant quivering, in which every fibre of her frame participated, had thrown her into a stupefied reverie in which her arms worked on independently of her consciousness. She hardly knew where she was, and did not hear Izz Huett tell her from below that her hair was tumbling down. By degrees the freshest among them began to grow cadaverous and saucer-eyed. Whenever Tess lifted her head she beheld always the great upgrown straw stack, with the men in shirt-sleeves upon it, against the grey north sky. In front of it the long red elevator, like a Jacob's ladder, on which a perpetual stream of threshed straw ascended, a yellow river running uphill and spouting out on the top of the rick. She knew that Alec d'Urberville was still on the scene, observing her from some point or other, though she could not say where. There was an excuse for his remaining, for when the threshed rick drew near its final sheaves, a little ratting was always done, and men unconnected with the threshing sometimes dropped in for that performance, sporting characters of all descriptions, gents with terriers and facetious pipes, roughs with sticks and stones. But there was another hour's work before the layer of live rats at the base of the stack would be reached, and as the evening light in the direction of Giant's Hill by Abbott's Churnel dissolved away, the white-faced moon of the season arose from the horizon that lay towards Middleton Abbey and Shottsford on the other side. For the last hour or two Marian had felt uneasy about Tess, whom she could not get near enough to speak to, the other women having kept up their strength by drinking ale, and Tess having done without it through traditionary dread owing to its results at her home in childhood. But Tess still kept going. If she could not fill her part, she would have to leave, and this contingency, which she would have regarded with equanimity and even relief a month or two earlier, had become a terror since d'Urberville had begun to hover around her. The sheaf pitchers and feeders had now worked the rick so low that people on the ground could talk to them. To Tess's surprise, Farmer Groby came up on the machine to her, and said that if she desired to join her friend, he did not wish her to keep on any longer, and would send somebody else up to take her place. The friend was d'Urberville, she knew, and also that this concession had been granted in obedience to the request of that friend or enemy. She shook her head and toiled on. The time for the rat-catching arrived at last, and the hunt began. The creatures had crept downwards with the subsidence of the rick till they were all together at the bottom, and being now uncovered from their last refuge, they ran across the open ground in all directions, a loud shriek from the, by this time, half-tipsy Marian informing her companions that one of the rats had invaded her person, a terror which the rest of the women had guarded against by various schemes of skirt-tucking and self-elevation. The rat was at last dislodged, and, amid the barking of dogs, masculine shouts, feminine screams, oaths, stampings and confusion as of pandemonium, Tess untied her last sheaf. The drum slowed, the whizzing ceased, and she stepped down from the machine to the ground. Her lover, who had only looked on at the rat-catching, was promptly at her side. "What, after all my insulting slap too?" she said in an underbreath. She was so utterly exhausted that she had not strength to speak louder. "I should indeed be foolish to feel offended at anything you say or do," he answered in the seductive voice of the Trantridge time. "How the little limbs tremble! You are as weak as a bled calf, you know you are, and yet you need to have done nothing since I arrived. How could you be so obstinate? However, I have told the farmer that he has no right to employ women at steam threshing. It is not proper work for them, and on all the better class of farms it has been given up, as he knows very well. I will walk with you as far as your home." "Oh yes," she answered with a jaded gait. "Walk with me if you will. I do bear in mind that you came to marry me before you knew of my state. Perhaps you are a little better and kinder than I have been thinking you were. Whatever is meant as kindness I am grateful for. Whatever is meant in any other way I am angered at. I cannot sense your meaning sometimes." "If I cannot legitimize our former relations, I can at least assist you, and I will do it with much more regard for your feelings than I formerly showed. My religious mania, or whatever it was, is over, but I retain a little good nature. I hope I do. Now, Tess, by all that's tender and strong between man and woman, trust me. I have enough and more than enough to put you out of anxiety, both for yourself and your parents and sisters. I can make them all comfortable, if you will only show confidence in me." "Have you seen him lately?" she quickly inquired. "Yes. They didn't know where you were. It was only by chance that I found you here." The cold moon looked aslant upon Tess's fagged face between the twigs of the garden hedge as she paused outside the cottage which was her temporary home, d'Urberville pausing beside her. "Don't mention my little brothers and sisters. Don't make me break down quite," she said. "If you want to help them, God knows they need it, do it without telling me. But no, no," she cried, "I will take nothing from you, either for them or for me." He did not accompany her further, since, as she lived with the household, all was public indoors. No sooner had she herself entered, lathered herself in a washing tub, and shared supper with the family, than she fell into thought, and withdrawing to the table under the wall, by the light of her own little lamp, wrote in a passionate mood: "My own husband. Let me call you so. I must, even if it makes you angry to think of such an unworthy wife as I. I must cry to you in my trouble. I have no one else. I am so exposed to temptation, Angel. I fear to say who it is, and I do not like to write about it at all, but I cling to you in a way you cannot think. Can you not come to me now at once, before anything terrible happens? Oh, I know you cannot, because you are so far away. I think I must die if you do not come soon, or tell me to come to you. The punishment you have measured out to me is deserved. I know that, well deserved, and you are right and just to be angry with me. But, Angel, please, please, do not be just. Only a little kind to me, even if I do not deserve it, and come to me. If you would come, I could die in your arms. I would be well content to do that, if so be you had forgiven me. Angel, I live entirely for you. I love you too much to blame you for going away, and I know it was necessary you should find a farm. Do not think I shall say a word of sting or bitterness. Only come back to me. I am desolate without you, my darling. Oh, so desolate. I do not mind having to work, but you will send me one little line and say, 'I am coming soon.' I will bide on, Angel, oh, so cheerfully. It has been so much my religion ever since we were married to be faithful to you in every thought and look, that even when a man speaks a compliment to me before I am aware, it seems wronging you. Have you never felt one little bit of what you used to feel when we were at the dairy? If you have, how can you keep away from me? I am the same woman, Angel, as you fell in love with, yes, the very same, not the one you disliked but never saw. What was the past to me as soon as I met you? It was a dead thing altogether. I became another woman, filled full of new life from you. How could I be the early one? Why did you not see this? Dear, if you would only be a little more conceited, and believe in yourself so far as to see that you were strong enough to work this change in me, you would perhaps be in a mind to come to me, your poor wife. How silly I was in my happiness when I thought I could trust you always to love me. I ought to have known that such was not for poor me. But I am sick at heart, not only for old times, but for the present. Think how it do hurt my heart not to see you ever, ever. If I can only make your dear heart ache one little minute of each day, as mine does every day and all day long, it might lead you to show pity to your poor lonely one.
People still say that I am rather pretty, Angel. Handsome is the word they use, since I wish to be truthful. Perhaps I am what they say, but I do not value my good looks. I only like to have them because they belong to you, my dear, and that they may be at least one thing about me worth your having. So much have I felt this, that when I met with annoyance on account of the same, I tied up my face in a bandage, as long as people would believe in it. Oh, Angel, I tell you this not from vanity, you will certainly know I do not, but only that you may come to me. If you really cannot come to me, will you let me come to you? I am, as I say, worried, pressed to do that I will not do. It cannot be that I shall yield 1 inch, yet I am in terror as to what an accident might lead to, and I so defenceless on account of my first error. I cannot say more about this. It makes me too miserable. But if I break down by falling into some fearful snare, my last state will be worse than my first. Oh God, I cannot think of it. Let me come at once, or at once come to me. I would be content, glad to live with you as your servant, if I may not as your wife, so that I could only be near you and get glimpses of you and think of you as mine. The daylight has nothing to show me, since you are not here, and I don't like to see the rooks and starlings in the field, because I grieve and grieve to miss you, who used to see them with me. I long for only one thing in heaven or earth or under the earth, to meet you, my own dear. Come to me, and save me from what threatens me. Your faithful, heartbroken Tess. End of chapter 48.
Of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Praetzellis.
Chapter 49. The appeal duly found its way to the breakfast table of the quiet vicarage to the westward, in that valley where the air is so soft and the soil so rich that the effort of growth requires but superficial aid by comparison with the tillage at Flintcombe Ash, and where, to Tess, the human world seemed so different, though it was much the same. It was purely for security that she had been requested by Angel to send her communications through his father, whom he kept pretty well informed of his changing addresses in the country he had gone to exploit for himself, with a heavy heart. "Now," said old Mr Clare to his wife when he had read the envelope, "if Angel proposes leaving Rio for a visit home at the end of next month, as he told us he hoped to do, I hope this may hasten his plans, for I believe it to be from his wife." He breathed deeply at the thought of her, and the letter was redirected to be promptly sent on to Angel. "Dear fellow, I hope he will get home safely," murmured Mrs Clare. "To my dying day I shall feel that he has been ill-used. You should have sent him to Cambridge, in spite of his want of faith, and given him the same chance the other boys had. He would have grown out of it under proper influence, and perhaps would have taken orders after all. Church or no church, it would have been fairer to him." This was the only wail with which Mrs Clare ever disturbed her husband's peace in respect to their sons, and she did not vent this often, for she was as considerate as she was devout, and knew that his mind too was troubled by doubts as to his justice in this matter. Only too often had she heard him lying awake at night, stifling sighs for Angel with prayers. But the uncompromising evangelical did not even now hold that he would have been justified in giving his son, an unbeliever, the same academic advantages that he had given the two others, when it was possible, if not probable, that those very advantages might have been used to decry the doctrines which he had made it his life's mission desire to propagate, and the mission of his ordained sons likewise. To put with one hand a pedestal under the feet of the two faithful ones, and with the other to exalt the unfaithful by the same artificial means, he deemed to be alike inconsistent with his convictions, his position, and his hopes. Nevertheless, he loved his misnamed angel, and in secret mourned over this treatment of him, as Abraham might have mourned over the doomed Isaac while they went up the hill together. His silent, self-generated regrets were far bitterer than the reproaches which his wife rendered audible. They blamed themselves for this unlucky marriage. If Angel had never been destined for a farmer, he would never have been thrown with agricultural girls. They did not distinctly know what had separated him and his wife, nor the date on which the separation had taken place. At first they supposed it must be something of the nature of a serious aversion, but in his later letters he occasionally alluded to the intention of coming home to fetch her, from which expressions they hoped the division might not owe its origin to anything so hopelessly permanent as that. He had told them that she was with her relatives, and in their doubts they had decided not to intrude into a situation which they knew no way of bettering. The eyes for which Tess's letter was intended were gazing at this time on a limitless expanse of country from the back of a mule which was bearing him from the interior of the South American continent towards the coast. His experiences of this strange land had been sad. The severe illness from which he had suffered shortly after his arrival had never wholly left him, and he had by degrees almost decided to relinquish his hope of farming here, though, as long as the bare possibility existed of his remaining, he kept this change of view a secret from his parents. The crowds of agricultural labourers who had come out to the country in his wake, dazzled by representations of easy independence, had suffered, died, and wasted away. He would see mothers from English farms trudging along with their infants in their arms, when the child would be stricken with fever and would die. The mother would pause to dig a hole in the loose earth with her bare hands, would bury the babe therein with the same natural grave tools, shed one tear, and again trudge on. Angel's original intention had not been emigration to Brazil, but a northern or eastern farm in his own country. He had come to this place in a fit of desperation, the Brazil movement among the English agriculturalists having by chance coincided with his desire to escape from his past existence. During this time of absence he had mentally aged a dozen years. What arrested him now as of value in life was less its beauty than its pathos. Having long discredited the old systems of mysticism, he now began to discredit the old appraisements of morality. He thought they wanted readjusting. Who was the moral man? Still, more pertinently, who was the moral woman? The beauty or ugliness of a character lay not only in its achievements, but in its aims and impulses. Its true history lay not among things done, but among things willed. How, then, about Tess? Viewing her in these lights, a regret for his hasty judgment began to oppress him. Did he reject her eternally, or did he not? He could no longer say that he would always reject her, and not to say that was in spirit to accept her now. This growing fondness for her memory coincided in point of time with her residence at Flintcomb Ash, but it was before she had found herself at liberty to trouble him with a word about her circumstances or her feelings. He was greatly perplexed, and in his perplexity as to her motives in withholding intelligence he did not inquire. Thus her silence of docility was misinterpreted. How much it really said, if he had understood, that she adhered with literal exactness to orders which he had given and forgotten; that despite her natural fearlessness she asserted no rights, admitted his judgment to be in every respect the true one, and bent her head dumbly thereto. In the before-mentioned journey by mules through the interior of the country, another man rode beside him. Angel's companion was also an Englishman, bent on the same errand, though he came from another part of the island. They were both in a state of mental depression, and they spoke of home affairs. Confidence begat confidence. With that curious tendency evinced by men, more especially when in distant lands, to entrust to strangers details of their lives which they would on no account mention to friends, Angel admitted to this man, as they rode along, the sorrowful facts of his marriage. The stranger had sojourned in many more lands and among many more peoples than Angel. To his cosmopolitan mind such deviations from the social norm, so immense to domesticity, were no more than the irregularities of vale and mountain chain to the whole terrestrial curve. He viewed the matter in quite a different light from Angel, thought that what Tess had been was of no importance besides what she would be, and plainly told Clare that he was wrong in coming away from her. The next day they were drenched in a thunderstorm. Angel's companion was struck down with fever, and died by the week's end. Clare waited a few hours to bury him, and then went on his way. The cursory remarks of the large-minded stranger, of whom he knew absolutely nothing beyond a mere commonplace name, were sublimed by his death, and influenced Clare more than all the reasoned ethics of the philosophers. His own parochialism made him ashamed by its contrast. His inconsistencies rushed upon him in a flood. He had persistently elevated Hellenic paganism at the expense of Christianity, yet in that civilization an illegal surrender was not certain disesteem. Surely then he might have regarded the abhorrence of the unintact state which he had inherited with the creed of mysticism as at least open to correction when the result was due to treachery. Remorse struck into him. The words of Izz Huett, never quite stilled in his memory, came back to him. He had asked Izz if she loved him, and she had replied in the affirmative. Did she love him more than Tess did? No, she had replied. Tess would lay down her life for him, and she herself could do no more. He thought of Tess as she had appeared on the day of the wedding, how her eyes had lingered upon him, how she had hung upon his words as if they were a god's. And during the terrible evening over the hearth, when her simple soul uncovered itself to his, how pitiful her face had looked by the rays of the fire, in her inability to realize that his love and protection could possibly be withdrawn. Thus, from being her critic, he grew to be her advocate. Cynical things he had uttered to himself about her, but no man can be always a cynic and live, and he withdrew them. The mistake of expressing them had arisen by his allowing himself to be influenced by general principles to the disregard of the particular instance. But the reasoning is somewhat musty. Lovers and husbands have gone over the ground before today. Clare had been harsh towards her, there was no doubt of it. Men are too often harsh with women they love or have loved, women with men. And yet these harshnesses are tenderness itself when compared with the universal harshness out of which they grow, the harshness of the position towards the temperament, of the means towards the aims, of today towards yesterday, of hereafter towards today. The historic interest of her family, that masterful line of d'Urbervilles, whom he had despised as a spent force, touched his sentiments now. Why had he not known the difference between the political value and the imaginative value of these things? In the latter aspect her d'Urberville descent was a fact of great dimensions. Worthless to economics, it was a most useful ingredient to the dreamer, to the moralizer on declines and falls. It was a fact that would soon be forgotten, that bit of distinction in poor Tess's blood and name, and oblivion would fall upon her hereditary link with the marble monuments and leaded skeletons at Kingsbere. So does time ruthlessly destroy his own romances. In recalling her face again and again, he thought now that he could see therein a flash of the dignity which must have graced her granddames, and the vision sent that aura through his veins which he had formerly felt, and which left behind it a sense of sickness. Despite her not inviolate past, what still abode in such a woman as Tess outvalued the freshness of her fellows. Was not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? So spoke love renascent, preparing the way for Tess's devoted outpouring, which was then just being forwarded to him by his father, though owing to his distance inland it was to be a long time in reaching him. Meanwhile the writer's expectation that Clare would come in response to the entreaty was alternately great and small. What lessened it was that the facts of her life which had led to the parting had not changed, could never change, and that if her presence had not attenuated them, her absence could not. Nevertheless she addressed her mind to the tender question of what she could do to please him best if he should arrive. Sighs were expended on the wish that she had taken more notice of the tunes he played on his harp, that she had inquired more curiously of him which were his favourite ballads among those the country girls sang. She indirectly inquired of Amby Seedling, who had followed Liz from Talbothays, and by chance Amby remembered that amongst the snatches of melody in which they had indulged at the dairyman's to induce the cows to let down their milk, Clare had seemed to like Cupid's Gardens, I Have Parks, I Have Hounds, and The Break o' the Day, and had not seemed to care for The Tailor's Breeches and Such a Beauty I Did Grow, excellent ditties as they were. To perfect the ballads was now her whimsical desire. She practised them privately at odd moments, especially The Break o' the Day. Arise, 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 and pick your love a posy, all o' the sweetest flowers that in the garden grow, the turtle doves and small birds in every bough a building, so early in the Maytime, at the break o' the day. It would have melted the heart of stone to hear her singing these ditties whenever she worked apart from the rest of the girls in this cold, dry time, the tears running down her cheeks all the while at the thought that perhaps he would not, after all, come to hear her, and the simple, silly words of the songs resounding in painful mockery of the aching heart of the singer. Tess was so wrapped up in this fanciful dream that she seemed not to know how the season was advancing, that the days had lengthened, that Lady Day was at hand, and would soon be followed by Old Lady Day, the end of her term here. But before the quarter day had quite come, something happened which made Tess think of far different matters. She was at her lodging, as usual, one evening, sitting in the downstairs room with the rest of the family, when somebody knocked at the door and inquired for Tess. Through the doorway she saw against the declining light a figure with the height of a woman and the breadth of a child, a tall, thin, girlish creature, whom she did not recognise in the twilight till the girl said, "Tess."
"What? Is it 'Liza Lu?" asked Tess in startled accents.
Her sister, whom a little over a year ago she had left at home as a child, had sprung up by a sudden shoot to a form of this presentation, of which as yet Lu seemed herself scarce able to understand the meaning. Her thin legs, visible below her once long frock, now short by her growing, and her uncomfortable hands and arms revealed her youth and inexperience.
"Yes, I have been traipsing about all day, Tess," said Lu with unemotional gravity, "a-trying to find 'ee, and I'm very tired."
"What is the matter at home?"
"Mother is took very bad, and the doctor says she's dying, and his father is not very well neither, and says 'tis wrong for a man of such high family as his to slave and drave at common labouring work, and we don't know what to do."
Tess stood in reverie a long time before she thought of asking 'Liza Lu to come in and sit down. When she had done so, and 'Liza Lu was having some tea, she came to a decision. It was imperative that she should go home. Her agreement did not end till Old Lady Day, the 6th of April, but as the interval there too was not a long one, she resolved to run the risk of starting at once. To go that night would be a gain of 12 hours, but her sister was too tired to undertake such a distance till the morrow. Tess ran down to where Marian and Izz lived, informed them of what had happened, and begged them to make the best of her case with the farmer. Returning, she got Lu a supper, and after that, having tucked the younger up into her own bed, packed up as many of her belongings as would go into a withy basket, and started, directing Lu to follow her the next morning. End of chapter 49. Of TESS of the D'URBERVILLES. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. TESS of the D'URBERVILLES by Thomas Hardy. Read by Adrian Praetzellis. Chapter 50. She plunged into the chilly equinoctial darkness as the clock struck 10 for her 15 miles walk under the steely stars. In lonely districts night is a protection rather than a danger to a noiseless pedestrian, and knowing this, Tess pursued the nearest course along byways that she would almost have feared in the daytime. But marauders were wanting now, and spectral fears were driven out of her mind by thoughts of her mother. Thus she proceeded, mile after mile, ascending and descending, till she came to Bulbarrow, and about midnight looked from that height into the abyss of chaotic shade, which was all that had revealed itself of the vale on whose further side she was born. Having already traversed about 5 miles on the upland, she had some 10 or 11 on the lowland before her journey would be finished. The winding road downwards became just visible to her under the wan starlight as she followed it, and soon she paced a soil so contrasting with that above it that the difference was perceptible to the tread and to the smell. It was the heavy clay land of Blackmoor Vale, and a part of the vale to which the turnpike roads had never penetrated. Superstitions linger longest on these heavy soils. Having once been forest, at this shadowy time it seemed to assert something of its old character, the far and the near being blended, and every tree and tall hedge making the most of its presence. The harts that had been hunted here, the witches that had been pricked and ducked, the green-spangled fairies that whickered as you passed. The place teemed with beliefs in them still, and they formed an impish multitude now. At Nuttlebury she passed the village inn, whose sign creaked in response to the greeting of her footsteps, which not a human soul heard but herself. Under the thatched roofs her mind's eye beheld relaxed tendons and flaccid muscles spread out in the darkness beneath coverlets made of little purple patchwork squares, and undergoing a bracing process at the hands of sleep for renewed labour on the morrow, as soon as a hint of pink nebulously appeared on Hambledon Hill. At 3 she turned the last corner of the maze of lanes she had threaded, and entered Marlott, passing the field in which as a club girl she had first seen Angel Clare, when he had not danced with her. The sense of disappointment remained with her yet. In the direction of her mother's house she saw a light. It came from the bedroom window, and a branch waved in front of it and made it wink at her. As soon as she could discern the outline of the house, newly thatched with her money, it had all its old effect upon Tess's imagination. Part of her body and life it ever seemed to be, the slope of its dormers, the finish of its gables, the broken courses of brick which toppled the chimney, had all something in common with her personal character. A stupefaction had come into these features to her regard. It meant the illness of her mother. She opened the door so softly as to disturb nobody. The lower room was vacant, but the neighbour, who was sitting up with her mother, came to the top of the stairs and whispered that Mrs. D'Urberville was no better, though she was sleeping just then. Tess prepared herself a breakfast, and then took her place as nurse in her mother's chamber. In the morning, when she contemplated the children, they had all a curiously elongated look. Although she had been away little more than a year, their growth was astounding, and the necessity of applying herself heart and soul to their needs took her out of her own cares. Her father's ill health was the same indefinite kind, and he sat in his chair as usual. But the day after her arrival he was unusually bright. He had a rational scheme for living, and Tess asked him what it was. "I'm thinking of sending round to all the old antiquarians in this part of England," he said, "asking them to subscribe to a fund to maintain me. I'm sure they'd see it as a romantical, artistical and proper thing to do. They spends lots of money in keeping up old ruins and finding the bones of things and such like, and living remains must be more interesting to 'em still, if they only knowed of me. Would that somebody would go round and tell 'em what there is living among 'em, and they thinking nothing of him. If Parson Tringham, who discovered me, had lived, he'd have done it, I'm sure." Tess postponed her arguments on this high project till she had grappled with pressing matters in hand, which seemed little improved by her remittances. When indoor necessities had been eased, she turned her attention to external things. It was now the season for planting and sowing. Many gardens and allotments of the villagers had already received their spring tillage, but the garden and the allotment of the D'Urbervilles were behindhand. She found, to her dismay, that this was owing to their having eaten all the seed potatoes, that last lapse of the improvident. At the earliest moment she obtained what others she could procure, and in a few days her father was well enough to see to the garden, under Tess's persuasive efforts, while she herself undertook the allotment plot, which they rented in a field a couple of 100 yards out of the village. She liked doing it, after the confinement of the sick chamber, where she was not now required by reasons of her mother's improvement. Violent motion relieved thought. The plot of ground was in a high, dry, open enclosure, where there were 40 or 50 such pieces, and where labour was at its briskest when the hired labour of the day had ended. Digging began usually at 6 o'clock, and extended indefinitely into the dusk or moonlight. Just now heaps of dead weeds and refuse were burning on many of the plots, the dry weather favouring their combustion. One fine day Tess and 'Liza Lu worked on here with their neighbours till the last rays of the sun smote flat upon the white pegs that divided the plots. As soon as twilight succeeded to sunset, the flare of the couch grass and the cabbage stalk flies began to light up the allotments fitfully, their outlines appearing and disappearing under the dense smoke as wafted by the wind. When a fire glowed, banks of smoke blown level along the ground would themselves become illuminated to an opaque lustre, screening the workpeople from one another, and the meaning of the pillar of a cloud, which was a wall by day and a light by night, could be understood. As evening thickened, some of the gardening men and women gave over for the night, but the greater number remained to get their planting done, Tess being among them, though she sent her sister home. It was on one of the couch-burning plots that she laboured with her fork, its 4 shining prongs resounding against the stones and dry clods in little clicks. Sometimes she was completely involved in the smoke of her fire, then it would leave her figure free, irradiated by the brassy glare from the heap. She was dressed oddly tonight, and presented a somewhat staring aspect, her attire being a gown bleached by many washings, with a short black jacket over it, the effect of the whole being that of a wedding and a funeral guest in one. The women further back wore white aprons which, with their pale faces, were all that could be seen of them in the gloom, except when at moments they caught a flash from the flames. Westward, the wiry boughs of the bare thorn hedge which formed the boundary of the field rose against the pale opalescence of the lower sky. Above, Jupiter hung like a full-blown jonquil, as bright as almost to throw a shade. A few small nondescript stars were appearing elsewhere. In the distance a dog barked, and wheels occasionally rattled along the dry road. Still the prongs continued to click assiduously, for it was not late, and though the air was fresh and keen, there was a whisper of spring in it that cheered the workers on. Something in the place, the hours, the crackling fires, the fantastic mysteries of light and shade, made others as well as Tess enjoy being there. Nightfall, which in the frost of winter comes as a fiend, and in the warmth of summer as a lover, came as a tranquillizer on this March day. Nobody looked at his or her companions. The eyes of all were on the soil as its turned surface was revealed by the fires. Hence, as Tess stirred the clods and sang her foolish little songs with scarce now a hope that Clare would ever hear them, she did not for a long time notice the person who worked nearest her, a man in a long smock frock, who, she found, was forking the same plot as herself, and whom she supposed her father had sent there to advance the work. She became more conscious of him when the direction of his digging brought him closer. Sometimes the smoke divided them, then it swerved, and the two were visible to each other, but divided from all the rest. Tess did not speak to her fellow worker, nor did he speak to her, nor did she think of him further than to recollect that he had not been there when it was broad daylight, and that she did not know him as one of any of the Marlott labourers, which was no wonder, her absence being so long and infrequent of late years. By and by he dug so close to her that the fire beams were reflected as distinctly from the steel prongs of his fork as from her own. On going up to the fire to throw a pitch of dead weeds upon it, she found that he did the same on the other side. The fire flared up, and she beheld the face of d'Urberville. The unexpectedness of his presence, the grotesqueness of his appearance in a gathered smock frock, such as was now worn only by the most old-fashioned of the labourers, had a ghastly comicality that chilled her as to its bearing. D'Urberville emitted a long, low laugh. "If I were inclined to joke, I should say, 'How much this seems like paradise!'" he remarked whimsically, looking at her with an inclined head. "What do you say?" she weakly asked. "A jester might say this is just like paradise. You are Eve, and I am the old other one, come to tempt you in the disguise of an inferior animal. I used to be quite up in that scene of Milton's when I was theological. Some of it goes: Empress, the way is ready and not long, beyond a row of myrtles. If thou accept my conduct, I can bring thee hither soon. Lead then, said Eve, and so on. My dear Tess, I am only putting this to you as a thing that you might have supposed, or said quite untruly, because you think so badly of me." "I never said you were Satan or thought it. I don't think of you in that way at all. My thoughts of you are quite cold, except when you affront me. What, did you come digging here entirely because of me?" "Entirely. To see you, nothing more. The smock frock, which I saw hanging for sale as I came along, was an afterthought, that I mightn't be noticed. I come to protest against your working like this." "But I like doing it. It is for my father." "Your engagement at the other place is ended?" "Yes." "Where are you going next? To join your dear husband?" She could not bear the humiliating reminder. "Oh, I don't know," she said bitterly. "I have no husband." "It is quite true in the sense you mean, but you have a friend, and I have determined that you shall be comfortable in spite of yourself. When you get down to your house you will see what I have sent there for you." "Oh, Alec, I wish you wouldn't give me anything at all. I cannot take it from you. I don't like... It is not right." "It is right," he cried lightly. "I'm not going to see a woman whom I feel so tenderly for as I do for you, in trouble without trying to help her." "But I am very well off. I'm only in trouble not about living at all." She turned and desperately resumed her digging, tears dripping upon the fork handle and upon the clods. "About the children, your brothers and sisters," he resumed. "I've been thinking of them." Tess's heart quivered. He was touching her in a weak place. He had divined her chief anxiety. Since returning home her soul had gone out to these children with an affection that was passionate. "If your mother does not recover, somebody ought to do something for them, since your father will not be able to do much, I suppose." "He can with my assistance. He must." "And with mine." "No, sir." "How damned foolish this is!" burst out d'Urberville. "Why, he thinks we are the same family, and will be quite satisfied." "He don't. I've undeceived him." "The more fool you." D'Urberville in anger retreated from her to the hedge, where he pulled off the long smock frock which had disguised him, and rolling it up and pushing it into the couch fire, went away. Tess could not get on with her digging after this. She felt restless. She wondered if he had gone back to her father's house, and taking the fork in her hand proceeded homewards. Some 20 yards from the house she was met by one of her sisters. "Oh, Tessie, what do you think? Liza Lou is a-crying, and there's a lot of folk in the house, and mother is a good deal better, but they think father is dead." The child realized the grandeur of the news, and not as yet its sadness, and stood looking at Tess with round-eyed importance till, beholding the effect produced upon her, she said, "What, Tess? Shan't we talk to father never no more?" "But father was only a little bit ill," exclaimed Tess distractedly. Liza Lou came up. "He dropped down just now, and the doctor who was there for mother said there were no chance for him because his heart was growed in." Yes, the Durbeyfield couple had changed places. The dying one was out of danger, and the indisposed one was dead. The news meant even more than it sounded. Her father's life had a value apart from his personal achievements, or perhaps it would not have had much. It was the last of the 3 lives for whose duration the house and premises were held under a lease, and it had been long coveted by the tenant farmer for his regular labourers, who were stinted in cottage accommodation. Moreover, livers were disapproved of in villages almost as much as little freeholders, because of their independence of manner, and when a lease determined, it was never renewed. Thus the D'Urberfields, once d'Urbervilles, saw descending upon them the destiny which, no doubt, when they were among the Olympians of that country, they had caused to descend many a time, and severely enough, upon the heads of such landless ones as they themselves were now. So do flux and reflux, the rhythm of change, alternate and persist in everything under the sky. End of chapter 50.